King Henry VIII was a deeply problematic ruler and a legendary poonhound. Being Henry's wife was considered one of the most hazardous occupations in Tudor England, and it came with a one-third chance of losing one's head. In the modern world, a health and safety agency would step in and shut that shit down. It was simply too dangerous to marry the man. However, despite the obvious risks, it didn't stop the hoes from lining up to be the next headless queen. With Henry's penchant for executing his wives, they could have created an entire reality TV enterprise around the situation. Can you imagine sitting down to watch the next episode of Britain's Next Dead Queen? So You Think You Can Survive Henry VIII? Or The Bachelor, Tower of London edition. Women who Henry had fornicated with on every piece of furniture in his palace were not the only people he enjoyed destroying. If you study the man, you'll notice a bizarre trend, the sad downfall of men named Thomas. If you were a friend or advisor named Thomas, King Hank would expend immense energy in either ruining you or executing you once you lost favor. The moment you didn't fall in line with Henry's whims, typically something to do with his never-ending search for a new wife, you may as well have voluntarily climbed the Tower of London and practiced your best swan dive onto the lawn 89 feet below. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey was Henry's chief minister and de facto head of government for around 15 years. While Henry was out playing tennis and betting the daughters of the nobility, Cardinal Wolsey was managing the day-to-day governance of the realm. He served simultaneously as Lord Chancellor and Archbishop of York. He actively weakened the nobility by centralizing royal authority, making Henry even more powerful. Wolsey raised large sums of money through taxation and administrative reforms to help fund Henry's wars and also to cover the costs of all those executions for people who made the mistake of giving the king side-eye or farting within 5 miles of the Palace of Whitehall. It all went south when the cardinal failed to get Henry's marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, annulled, which had to happen before he could marry that tasty young treat named Anne Boleyn. Cardinal Wolsey was tasked with getting an annulment from the Pope quickly and without breaking England from Rome. The Vatican didn't grant annulments to kings just for shits and giggles. We're not talking about the modern-day church where you can walk in and say, "Hey, I'd like to get married in your Berry Stone church." "Well, are you Catholic?" "Sure, why not?" "Okay, give me $250. Cash only, please." Anyway, Wolsey failed, and the increasingly impatient and always horny King Henry decided that Thomas had outlived his usefulness. The cardinal was stripped of his office, charged with placing papal authority above royal authority, and ordered to surrender all property and power. Henry took Wolsey's Hampton Court Palace as his primary residence, and lived there until his death in 1547. To be fair, no alleged man of the cloth should live in a palace. I'm looking at you, Joel Osteen. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the lucky bugger, died in 1530 before facing trial for his charges. Don't feel bad for him. He had massively enriched himself while working for that ungrateful schmuck of a king, Henry, and was far from a righteous man. In 1529, after Henry gave Cardinal Wolsey the boot, he handed the job of Lord Chancellor to his friend, trusted advisor, and humanist scholar, Sir Thomas More. Someone has to do the work of running the kingdom, and it certainly wasn't going to be Henry. Professionally, More had been an attorney and judge. Personally, he was a devout Catholic. Like devout. He wasn't diet Catholic. He wore a hair shirt, meant to annoy the skin of the wearer, and performed self-flagellation. Yeah, that kind of Catholic. The king, however, was rather flexible in his religious beliefs and morality in general, and would morph his values depending on which young beauty he wanted to marry at any given time.
It's good to be the king.
Thomas More, obviously, didn't share Henry's views or moral ambiguity. He was incensed by the growing Protestant Reformation in Europe, deeming anything anti-Catholic as heresy. More was a proponent of burning heretics at the stake, and at least 6 people were barbecued during More's chancellorship. There were allegations that More personally tortured suspected heretics, but some accounts refute this. Still, though, I think he did it. What's he going to do, sue me? Doubtful. With Wolsey long gone, some of the leading English aristocrats penned a letter to the Pope requesting that he annul the king's marriage to Catherine, but More refused to sign it. He, to no one's surprise, still solidly believed in the supremacy of the papacy over earthly kings. Henry VIII eventually realized that the Pope didn't intend to give an annulment anytime soon, and Anne Boleyn wasn't going to be young, hot, and fertile forever, so his next plan of action was simple. Screw Rome. Who needs those guys in their funny hats and dresses anyway? That silly Pope dude can't tell me what to do. Church of England, here we come. Naturally, Thomas More also refused to support Henry's break from the church and, in 1532, resigned from his post. For the moment, though, he remained in the king's good favor. The whoremonger king finally married Anne Boleyn in 1533, but More didn't attend Anne's coronation. Henry saw this as a snub. It was, and began planning to put Thomas over his knee for a solid spanking. There were initial attempts to charge More with accepting bribes and even treason. Both those charges were either dismissed or not pursued. Henry's sycophants finally found a way to snare the man. They would use his devout righteousness against him. When they forced More to accept the spiritual validity of the king's second marriage, he refused. He also refused to sign anything which stated the king had supremacy over the church, or even the king's oath of succession. A few days after his refusal, More was arrested on the charge of high treason and tossed into the Tower of London, where he remained for 15 months. During his confinement, Thomas Cromwell, who, being named Thomas, we'll discuss later, visited More and begged him to take the oath that was required under the Act of Succession, which was intended to legitimize Anne Boleyn as queen and make her children legitimate heirs to the crown. Obviously, the zealot didn't take the oath. If he had, we wouldn't be discussing him right now, and instead of typing, I could be watching YouTube videos of Thai bar girls dancing. What I do for entertainment is none of your business. In 1535, the lazy asses finally brought More to trial, which was presided over by 3 judges named Thomas and 1 named George. We'll discuss 2 of those Thomases later, naturally. The jury found him guilty of hurting the king's feelings or some shit like that, and he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Henry, the ever-super-sweet monarch, commuted his longtime friend's sentence to execution by decapitation. What a swell guy. When the Church of England initially became an independent business, and no longer a franchisee of the Vatican, there were a great many citizens unhappy with the change, despite it remaining initially intact as a Catholic church. One act in particular set the peasantry on a path towards rebellion: the dissolution of the monasteries. Though the dissolution of the monasteries wasn't intended as an attack on Catholicism itself, it was certainly perceived that way, and it had real day-to-day effects on the rural poor, who were formerly able to depend on the church for food in hard times. The king certainly wasn't going to feed them. He was too busy cheating on his next wife, and the wife after her. Henry's intention was to seize their wealth, sell off their properties and relics, and rid England and Wales of religious houses whose allegiance was to Rome and not the King of England. Revolts and uprisings began, most of which were suppressed fairly quickly. One uprising in northern England, the Pilgrimage of Grace, which sounds a lot more like the name of a Christian rock band than a revolt, gained momentum, and putting out its flames wasn't a simple task. The act of rebellion lasted about 3 months, but it wasn't considered fully suppressed for about 6 to 8 months. Thomas Darcy was an English nobleman and soldier, serving as Lord Warden of the East Marches, and responsible for defending the northern border with Scotland. He was part of the traditional northern nobility that relied on local authority, Catholic institutions, and regional autonomy, all of which were being undermined by Henry VIII's centralizing reforms. This caused a fracture in Mr. Darcy's loyalty to the crown. Darcy was never considered a leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace, but he was there. Pontefract Castle was the one place where the rebels managed to put up a solid fight against the king's forces, and Thomas Darcy was in command of the castle. Despite claiming that the rebels compelled him to yield the castle to them, it was well known that Darcy's sympathies lay with their cause. He was charged with high treason. It's always high treason with these guys. And confined in the Tower of London. It's always the Tower of London with these guys. When questioned by the King's Privy Council, Thomas Darcy took the opportunity to warn Thomas Cromwell, who he hated, and, being named Thomas, we will discuss later, that he shouldn't get too comfortable being in the king's favor, saying basically, "You're an idiot if you don't realize that he's going to chop off your head too, Tom." Despite being convicted and condemned to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, those lazy buggers, once again, simply chopped off his head and placed it on the London Bridge, because why not? Thomas Cromwell was Henry's chief minister and architect of the English Reformation. Cromwell had actually worked under Cardinal Wolsey and learned how to run England by watching Wolsey do it. What he didn't learn was that Henry secretly hated all men named Thomas. Like Anne Boleyn, he had many different positions under Henry. Get it? Over time, Cromwell was Chancellor of the Exchequer, Master of the Rolls, whatever the hell that is, Lord Privy Seal, and Lord Great Chamberlain, amongst others. I refuse to Google what the Lord Privy Seal does, preferring instead to believe that he's the guy who makes sure that the bathroom door is locked, so that a noble's dwarf son doesn't come in and shoot him with a crossbow when he discovers that his father has been banging his girlfriend. If you know, you know. Cromwell was a creative fellow, and was the person who finally engineered an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though certainly not an annulment from Rome. This was more like an online university type of annulment. All he had to do was write some new laws, make the king the head of the church, and bam! His new startup church approved the annulment and allowed Henry to marry Anne before her uterus dried up and became nothing more than dust and broken dreams. Cromwell was absolutely instrumental in the reformation of the Church of England, and seems to have steered it more so than the king. Somewhat secretly, this wasn't a trial of faith for Thomas because he was, if anything, a religious pragmatist with Protestant leanings, not a Catholic. So destroying ties with Rome didn't make him lose a single second of sleep. Cromwell was efficient, ruthless, and indispensable, but, being a Thomas, he eventually managed to greatly disappoint the king. Guess what the falling out with the king was about? Yes, you're correct. It was about finding a new wife for Henry VIII. At this point, Henry had had 3 wives. He annulled his marriage to Catherine. He had Anne's head removed from her sexy taut body. Jane, we'll call her one of the lucky ones, died shortly after giving birth to a son. Wanting to secure a Protestant alliance with the German states, Thomas arranged a marriage with Anne of Cleves from the Duchy of Berg. Henry accepted the arrangement based on a small painting of Anne done by Hans Holbein. Holbein was considered a great portraitist, but I don't know. Have you seen his work? It's not exactly photorealistic, if you know what I mean. The animators at South Park could do a better job. Henry should have invested in a digital camera. Even one of those really old ones that took a 3.5-inch floppy could produce a better image than Hans Holbein. The problem was, when Henry finally met Anne of Cleves just days before their wedding, it wasn't love at first sight. According to the king, this new Anne was no Margot Robbie. He found her unattractive and became incensed at Cromwell for arranging the marriage. However, seeing no safe diplomatic exit, he married her anyway. Allegedly, the marriage was never consummated. I call bullshit on that. Henry claims he was repulsed by her. He was 48, she was 24. If you and your rotting, ulcerous leg are unable to perform, don't blame the woman. Man up, you little priss. Their marriage was annulled within 6 months. Apparently, the processing time for annulments is quite rapid when you don't have the Vatican involved. Anne of Cleves escaped Henry unscathed. The same cannot be said for poor Thomas Cromwell. With the king feeling embarrassed over the failed marriage, and maybe more so that his inability to consummate the marriage became common knowledge, Thomas's enemies, many of whom were against his religious reformations, began to rally and effect his downfall. At the same time, Thomas Howard, who we'll discuss soon, was busy pimping out his niece, Catherine, to the king, because that's what good friends do when you're down. They offer up their 17-year-old nieces to become the king's next pincushion. Thomas Cromwell was arrested in June of 1540 and charged with an array of mostly trumped-up charges which they defined as treason, heresy, and corruption. He didn't receive a trial and was publicly beheaded on the same day that Henry married Catherine Howard, who was, by the way, Henry's second wife Anne Boleyn's first cousin. Cromwell's head was placed on a spike on London Bridge because, why not? Thomas Wyatt the Elder was a poet, diplomat, and courtier, remembered today for introducing Italian Renaissance poetry to England, especially the sonnet. Well, I'll take Charles Bukowski any day over that nonsense. He also served Henry VIII on multiple diplomatic missions across Europe. Wyatt entered royal service as a clerk of the king's jewels. A clerk of what? Nasty. Later, he became Esquire of the Body to Henry VIII. Esquire to the Body. What the hell are these titles? Were these created to piss me off? His career as a diplomat took him to France, Spain, and the papal court, where he worked on missions concerning the king's marital annulment. Mark that one as a failure. Wyatt was educated, articulate, and culturally influential, exactly the kind of man Henry liked to keep close. Of course, that's also exactly the kind of man a young queen may want to keep close. Perhaps too close. And that was exactly what this poor schmuck was accused of. Wyatt's romantic intentions for Anne Boleyn were not a well-kept secret around court, and Dum-Dum Wyatt was briefly imprisoned at the Tower when Anne was arrested for many fabricated misdeeds. The basis of the accusations against Wyatt were based on an alleged affair with Anne prior to her marriage to Henry. Yes, years prior, before he could have possibly known that this little trollop was going to be the future Mrs. Henry Tudor. Let's apply this to modern times. Can you imagine having dated a young Kate Middleton in college? You do the deed a bunch of times, you get right up in that thing. And then, years later, she marries the future king. The next thing you know, you're sitting in the Tower while a prematurely balding Prince of Wales is prodding you with hot pokers because you hammered on Skinny Kate before he even knew her. Insanity. Fortunately for Thomas, nothing was ever substantiated. He was released and even continued his diplomatic duties to the crown. It was a very close call, which I'm sure left a stain on his underoos. Meanwhile, poor Anne's head was rolling around on the ground like a fallen apple. Speaking of the headless queen of Sleepy Hollow, let's discuss her father, Thomas Boleyn. Already, right there, being Anne's father in the court of King Henry is surely a crime on its own. No need to go further. Guilty. Sir Thomas Boleyn, a.k.a. the first Earl of Wiltshire, was a highly capable courtier and diplomat. He was intelligent, multilingual, and effective. He served Henry VIII on important diplomatic missions to France and the Low Countries, and was genuinely skilled at court politics. Most importantly, he had two beautiful daughters whom he would have pimped out to anyone who could help increase his wealth or status. History has a very unkind opinion of Mr. Boleyn, and it is well earned. He was slime, a real piece of shit. His daughter Anne and son George were both charged, tried, and executed for treason. And bear in mind, their crimes were likely works of fiction meant to expedite the king's path to his next fertile wife. Anne's womb produced a daughter and 2 miscarriages, not the son Henry so desperately needed, or so he thought, for his family to remain in power. She wasn't divorced, she was disposed of. Boleyn didn't rebel. He never publicly opposed Henry. He didn't oppose the verdicts. Not a peep. Silence. He simply crawled away, keeping his lands, titles, and wealth. He lived in disgrace, but did so in the comfort of his home, Hever Castle. There isn't much to say about Thomas Culpeper, thank goodness. He was a handsome young courtier to Henry VIII, and was eventually made a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Privy. Chamber. Chamber pot. Don't get me started again on this privy shit. As courtier, Thomas became a favorite of the king, and they formed a close relationship. This gave him extraordinary access to the king and a certain amount of influence. But, as we know, being named Thomas and being close to Henry was a lethal combination. Culpeper was accused of having an illicit relationship with the new sultry young queen, Catherine Howard. It's unknown if there was ever truly a physical relationship between the two. They didn't have hidden cameras and bugging devices back then. But you know which way I'm leaning. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And by fire, I mean lots of screwing. Culpeper was arrested in December of 1541 on charges of adultery. I never understood that. How is it adultery on my part? She's not my wife. Try her for it. Oh, wait. They did. Under interrogation, meaning copious amounts of torture, Thomas admitted to having sexy time with Catherine. And when you provide more pleasure to the 18-year-old queen than her 49-year-old husband does, you know heads are going to roll. And roll they did. Within days of the trial, Culpeper's head was removed by a sharp object. Guess what they did next? Correct, they placed his head on the London Bridge. What's the deal with all those heads on the bridge? There is a London Bridge in Arizona. I visited it several years ago. 0 heads. There isn't much the British can learn from Americans, but if there is one thing, it's how to keep a bridge head-free. Oh, with all this talk about heads and bridges, I almost forgot to mention that the supple young Queen Catherine lost her head a couple months later after being convicted of being a naughty little vixen, or something like that. I have always felt bad for Catherine. She was a foolish child who had been pimped into a world she was wholly unprepared to navigate. If I had been Henry, an obese, middle-aged man with an incurable, smelly, rotting leg wound, I would have given her a pass. Or infinite passes. Just do what you're going to do, but keep it quiet and don't bring home any diseases. Thanks, sweetie. You're the best. Anyway, this video is about Thomas's, not Catherine's, so let's keep moving forward. I have shit to do. Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, or as his friends called him, Big Tom, was one of England's most powerful nobles, a senior military commander, longtime court figure, and uncle to 2 of Henry VIII's queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Yes, he was uncle to the 2 wives Henry beheaded. How's that for family legacy? I would rather take my chances on Plenty of Fish or Tinder than go to that guy for dating advice. Howard had actually assisted the king and Thomas Cromwell on getting Henry's first marriage annulled, and was considered exceedingly loyal to the crown. Despite his family's loyalty, the king, in an aging court, was suspicious of anything that looked like succession plotting. Howard's son, the Earl of Surrey, had been imprisoned more than once for assuming the royal arms of Edward the Confessor as his personal heraldry. Here's the thing. Surrey was legally allowed to use the royal arms, but it was something one simply didn't do unless they had hoped to provoke the crown. It was poor etiquette. It was dangerous. In Henry's eyes, the Howards appeared to be building a case for their right to the throne over Henry's heirs. In December 1546, both Thomas Howard and his idiot son were arrested and delivered to everyone's favorite tower. The following month, Howard's son was convicted of treason and, yes, beheaded. On January 27, 1547, Henry ordered Howard's execution, which was then planned for the next day. However, the king dropped dead during the night, and Howard received a reprieve. He remained in the tower until 1553, when he was released by Queen Mary, the daughter Henry had with Queen Catherine of Aragon. It's difficult to say how many of the alleged crimes of the Thomases were factual, or simply nonsense their enemies in court whispered in Henry VIII's ear. Henry VIII ruled England for almost 24 years. They were 24 years of paranoia, of being easily manipulated, and pulled in whichever direction his current set of fake friends and advisors tugged. He divorced 2 wives and executed 2 more, likely due to the machinations of his court, not for any sin committed by the women who loved him. Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Darcy, Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Culpeper, Thomas Howard, Thomas Wyatt, and Thomas Boleyn were all men of ambition, and each devoted a portion of their lives to pleasing King Henry VIII. Just as with his wives, no amount of loyalty was ever enough. He was highly suspicious of those around him. Were many of them there in court to purely enrich themselves? Absolutely. Did any of them ever attack Henry or attempt to usurp his throne? No. What these gentlemen did was far more severe. They were born to parents who named them Thomas.